Is Clara Bennett and the Way It Was. Prologue. Alder Creek. The year was 1852, and Alder Creek was a stubborn streak of humanity clinging to the edge of California's untamed hills. At first glance, it hardly deserved to be called a town. Just a huddle of rough plank shacks, canvas tents, and the constant sprawl of mud where boots had churned the ground into something halfway between a street and a riverbed. The air carried the tang of wood smoke and the faint metallic scent of the creek itself. Each morning, before the sun had climbed above the Pine Ridge, men and women shuffled into the daylight, some with the slump of defeat already in their shoulders, others with a fierce, almost feverish glint in their eyes. Gold fever, they called it, a sickness that drove people to endure blistered hands, freezing water, and the endless grind of hope against reality. The creek sang its steady, rippling tune, punctuated by the scrape of shovels and the slow, patient swirl of pans. Veterans of the rush worked with quiet precision, knowing better than to rush the process, while newcomers attacked the gravel as if brute force could will gold from stone. At midday, Alder Creek was a contradiction, bustling yet brittle. Storefronts, little more than clapboard facades, sold flour for 10 times its price back east. A single nugget could buy a month's rations or disappear overnight at the saloon, traded for whiskey and the lies of fortune-tellers who promised the next strike. And yet, in the midst of this raw, unshaped world, there were stories unfolding. Not all were of gold. Some were of survival, of reinvention. One such story, one that would come to be whispered long after the gold was gone, began with a woman named Clara Bennett stepping off a stagecoach with nothing but a trunk, a widow's dress, and a will strong enough to bend steel. Chapter 1. The Journey West. Clara had not planned to leave Boston. The city had been her world. Red brick streets, the smell of the harbor, the steady routine of her husband's modest bookkeeping business. But cholera had stolen James from her in the spring of '51, and with him the little stability she had left. When the bank took their home, and the last of James's debts swallowed what savings remained, she faced two choices: wither under the pity of distant relatives, or gamble everything on a new beginning. The gold rush was on every tongue. Men were leaving for California by the thousands. Newspapers brimmed with tales of fortunes found in weeks. Few spoke of the failures. Fewer still mentioned what it was like for women. But Clara had heard enough to know there was more money in feeding miners than in panning for gold. She sold her wedding silver, bought a ticket west, and boarded a stagecoach that would carry her over plains, mountains, and deserts to a land she had only seen in woodcut illustrations. The journey was a test of endurance. The coach lurched over rutted tracks, wheels groaning, passengers swaying like sacks of grain. At night, the thin canvas tents offered little shelter from the wind's teeth. Yet Clara learned to endure. She mended her fellow travelers' clothes for a few coins, shared her coffee sparingly, and kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. When at last the stage rattled into Alder Creek, the place looked less like the gateway to fortune and more like a camp that had sprouted by accident. But Clara stepped down from the coach, smoothed her black skirts, and lifted her chin. She had not come to strike gold in the creek. She had come to build something lasting, if she could survive long enough to begin. Chapter 2. The First Winter. Alder Creek greeted newcomers with dust in summer and mud in winter, and Clara had arrived at the start of the wet season. She rented a corner of a boarding house from Mrs. Barlow, a stout woman with a sharp tongue and sharper eye for opportunity. Clara slept in a narrow bed between two thin walls and paid her rent by helping in the kitchen. It didn't take long to see how the town worked. Miners came in waves, some flush with gold, others broke and bitter. The few women in town either worked in the saloon, ran boarding houses, or cooked for hire. Clara decided she would do the latter, but she needed her own space. The first winter nearly ended her plans before they began. Food was scarce. Supply wagons got stuck in snow-choked passes. Prices soared. A sack of flour cost more than Clara had made in a week. She learned to stretch meals with beans, roots, and whatever could be coaxed from the meager kitchen garden. There were nights she went to bed hungry, so that the miners she fed could go to work with full bellies. She listened more than she spoke, storing away the knowledge that in this place, reliability was worth more than charm. By spring, she had saved enough to rent a small shack on the edge of town. Its roof leaked, and the door sagged on its hinges, but it was hers. Chapter 3: The Claim. At first, Clara thought she might try her hand at mining. She bought a used pan and a shovel from a miner too sick to work. For 2 weeks she stood in the icy shallows, swirling gravel and sand, her fingers numb and raw. She found flecks of gold, enough to thrill her heart, but not her purse. She realized quickly that her strength lay elsewhere. She began baking bread in a cast-iron Dutch oven, the yeasty smell drawing miners from the creek like bees to honey. At first, she sold a few loaves a day. Then, word spread. Soon, she was baking from dawn until dusk, her tiny shack filled with the heat of the oven and the crackle of the fire. Still, the gold fields were an uncertain tide. A good week meant she could buy more flour. A bad one meant she might have to close for days. And always, there was the risk. Fire, theft, sickness. Chapter 4: Setbacks. By the second year in Alder Creek, Clara had made a name for herself among the miners. Her bread and stews were reliable, hearty, and always available when she said they would be. But good reputation didn't keep misfortune at bay. It started with a late spring storm that flooded the creek and sent a wave of mud into the lower part of town. Clara's shack, perched just high enough to avoid the water, still took damage when the wind tore half the roof away. Repairs were costly, and she had to borrow against her meager savings to pay a carpenter. Then came the sickness. Fever swept through Alder Creek like a brush fire, carried by the damp and the closeness of so many people in small, smoky rooms. Clara fell ill herself, losing nearly 3 weeks of work. By the time she returned to baking, 2 of her regular suppliers had moved on to richer claims, and the price of flour had risen again. There were nights she lay awake in her bed, staring at the flicker of lamplight on the wall, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake leaving Boston. But each morning she rose, banked the fire, and started the day's bread. Even when she had nothing but thin soup to sell, she kept her doors open. In Alder Creek, stubbornness was as valuable as gold dust. Chapter 5: A Bold Plan. One evening in the saloon, while delivering a batch of bread to the barkeep, Clara overheard a conversation between 2 miners. They were complaining about the lack of fresh produce, saying they'd pay handsomely for a single apple or a bunch of carrots. The idea struck her like lightning. She had seen the fertile bend of land upriver, where the soil was dark and rich. If she could clear a small plot, She might grow vegetables to sell alongside her bread. It would be risky. Farming in the mountains meant battling unpredictable frosts and pests, but it could also mean freedom from the constant squeeze of flour prices. She spent the next week asking questions, gathering seed from traders, and striking a deal with a prospector who owned the riverside land but had no use for it. In exchange for bread each week, he let her fence off a corner for her garden. When spring came, Clara's days doubled in length. Mornings were for baking, afternoons were for turning the soil, planting rows, and carrying buckets of creek water. Her hands, already rough from kneading dough, grew calloused from the hoe and spade. But when the first shoots of green pushed through the earth, she felt a pride deeper than she'd ever known. Chapter 6. Building Something Real. By midsummer, Clara's garden was producing carrots, beans, and squash. The miners, starved for fresh food, paid her in gold dust, nuggets, and even labor. One man repaired her roof in exchange for a sack of beans. Word spread beyond Alder Creek. Teamsters passing through stopped to buy vegetables for their journeys. The steady trickle of income allowed Clara to hire a young orphaned girl, Millie, to help with the baking. Millie had quick hands and a bright smile, and under Clara's guidance, she learned to measure yeast and knead dough until it was smooth as river stones. Clara's shack became more than a place to eat. It was a gathering spot, a place where miners could exchange news and travelers could rest. She added a second table, then a third, until the little room was crowded from morning till night. For the first time since leaving Boston, Clara began to feel secure. She still worked from dawn to well past dark, but the constant fear of ruin began to loosen its grip. She was no longer merely surviving, she was building. Chapter 7. Hard-won respect. Not everyone welcomed Clara's success. A rival cook, Mrs. Latchford, accused her of watering down stew and overcharging for bread. A few drunken miners repeated the claims, and business dipped for a week. Clara refused to fight with words. Instead, she invited the town's lawman, the preacher, and 3 respected miners to eat at her place, free of charge. She served them her best, crusty loaves, thick beef stew with carrots from her garden, and a blackberry pie made from berries she'd traded for with a passing trapper. The verdict was unanimous. The men praised her cooking publicly, and Mrs. Latchford's accusations fizzled out. Respect in Alder Creek wasn't given lightly, especially to women. But Clara had earned it. She could walk down the street with her head high, knowing that she had carved her place here not by charm or luck, but by the steady weight of her work. Chapter 8. Expansion. 3 years after arriving in Alder Creek, Clara bought the shack next door. With the help of 2 miners she paid in bread and vegetables, she knocked down the wall between them and doubled her space. She added more tables, a larger oven, and a small counter for selling produce. Millie, now nearly grown, ran the baking in the mornings, freeing Clara to oversee the garden and manage supplies. Business was brisk. Even in lean mining months, travelers and teamsters kept money flowing. Clara began setting aside a portion of her earnings, tucking away gold dust in a tin under the floorboards. She had a dream now, not just to live well herself, but to bring her younger sister from Boston to join her. If she could save enough, she could give her family a new start, far from the crowded tenements they'd known. Chapter 9. A New Alder Creek. By the mid-1850s, Alder Creek had changed. The wild rush of fortune seekers had slowed, replaced by families and merchants who saw opportunity in stability. The muddy track became a proper street. The saloon added windows. A schoolhouse went up on the hill. Clara's place was a fixture of the town. She knew everyone, where they'd come from, what they'd risked to get here, and what they hoped to find. When disputes arose, her tables became neutral ground for settling them over coffee and bread. When her sister, Ruth, finally arrived after a long and dusty journey, Clara met her at the stage with a new dress and a home-cooked meal. Ruth wept at the sight of the little building, bustling with customers, smelling of bread and stew. "You've made a life here," she said. And Clara, with quiet pride, answered, "I have." Epilogue: The way it was. Years later, when the gold was gone, and Alder Creek was just another quiet town on the map, people still spoke of Clara Bennett. They remembered the bread, the garden, and the way her place always felt warm, even in the bitterest winters. Clara never struck gold in the creek, but she'd built something rarer, a life of her own making, rooted in work, community, and the stubborn belief that a woman alone could stand her ground in a man's world. The way life used to be, folks said, was hard. But if you were willing to rise each day and face it head-on, as Clara had, it could also be rich beyond measure.